One of the greatest wealth transfers in American history is underway. We'll talk about its economic impact today on Builders Live. Hey, I'm Chris Wink. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Technically, the news organization with a community of technologists and entrepreneurs. Generational wealth transfer, something very enormous is happening. We at Technically have covered portions of it through the years. We wanted to take it on head on and understand what its economic impact will be for communities we serve and others. To do that, we have two friends to join the conversation. Jamie Sears, she's the co-head of Impact for UBS Americas and actually helped push me into this conversation. Thank you for that, Jamie. And Todd Leverette, founding partner at Apis and Heritage, which helps workers buy the companies they work for. Jamie, Todd, thank you guys for being here.
Thank you, Chris. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So, all right, Jamie, I got to admit, you years back are one of the first people to push me on this as a massive economic transition underway. So help set the foundation with the basics. What do we mean by the generational wealth transfer and why the heck does it matter so much?
Thank you for the question. So UBS is the world's largest wealth manager. So obviously this is something that we think about, we research, we discuss. And the reason why I'm personally interested and excited to talk about this is because the focus of my group, the Social Impact and Philanthropy Services team, because for us, it's fundamentally about wealth with purpose. I did do some homework for this because I thought
I would hope.
Yeah, that could underscore this, specifically in the US. So in the next 20 years, $84 trillion is expected to be passed to younger generations. And so 2/3 of that will go to Gen X and millennials. And not only that, as of 2020, women in the US already controlled $11 trillion. So about 1/3 of the financial assets, in wealth, and that number could reach 30 trillion by the end of this decade. So that's 2030. And I think these handovers signify more than just a pure transfer of financial wealth, but an enormous shift in terms of how wealth is used as a vehicle for purpose. So if I just use women as a case study, our firm spoke with thousands of women last year and found that 90% of women saw money as a tool to help fulfill their purpose. And I think this has ripple effects across the impact economy, from charitable contributions to aligning investments. And with this, it's not just that this is a belief, they're actually putting that into action. 50% of them already have investments into products with an environmental or social impact. And generationally as well, the reason why I see this really bright spot in the future is that millennial women of those that we spoke to are leading the way, using their money to fulfill their purpose and create positive change. More than half already have ensured their investments align with their values, compared to 24% of women who are in the boomer generation. And millennial women are also twice as likely to buy from companies that have a positive social impact. So I think this generational shift presents us with almost a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, given the interests and behaviors of these groups and where the assets are going. There are a few examples of women who are investors and philanthropists, Mackenzie Scott, Melinda French Gates. And I point those two women out in particular just because they have directed a lot of their philanthropic and impact capital to support the needs of underrepresented groups. And I think this is actually really important. The transition that we're talking about marks a shift about how capital can be directed and address some of our most pressing issues that we face.
The once in a lifetime strikes a chord because journalists, so often that phrase is used hyperbolically, but it's not in this context, right? Like we have the biggest generation of its era, baby boom generation, that comes of age when this country gets as rich as it ever has. And there's a moment in transition before the size of our country is going to shift. So big wealth accumulation, where it goes next, is going to matter. So Todd, this is where Apis and Heritage gets very interesting. I want to dig into what you guys do specifically, but the broader point is one of those asset classes that disproportionately shows up among wealthier families is business ownership. So maybe just like touch us with some of the basics. Why is business ownership disproportionately showing up in this conversation on wealth transfer? Why is that part of it something we got to get right?
No, great question, Chris. And Jamie gave some great numbers around the scope and the size of that shift. When you look at the business ownership, the income producing assets that are owned by a lot of baby boomers, of that 80 trillion, more than $10 trillion of that value of that wealth is in existing businesses that are in the hands of business owners. And I think the risk that comes along if we're not taking advantage of the opportunity to move these assets in more equitable ways and in ways that have a broader impact across the economy. The risk is that, one, a lot of these wealth producing assets, when we're talking about businesses, end up transferring in some traditional ways that leave them in the hands of a smaller group of people. So, almost 50% of the wealth in the United States is held by a very small number of people. And there's a risk that number gets even larger and you have the rest of the population having even less wealth. And then the opportunity behind it is, if we move this wealth in a way, if we move these income producing assets, these businesses over to broader groups of the population, which is what we do at APIS and Heritage using employee ownership, we can do two things. We can help these asset owners, these business owners to get liquidity for the businesses, which can often be difficult. And there's often a risk of them not transferring the business and that wealth just kind of going away. So we can help them get liquidity and transfer the asset, while at the same time providing the opportunity for their base of employees who help them build the business to start to get on a path towards asset ownership and wealth building as well. So that business side is really, really important. It shouldn't be ignored. And the last stat I'll throw at you is, when you think about wealth gaps, and this is where we focus on wealth gaps and racial wealth gaps, the largest component of wealth gaps and racial wealth gaps is typically housing, but the number two component is business ownership and equity ownership through retirement accounts. And our model addresses both of those.
So I want to come back to APIS and Heritage in a sec here, but Jamie, you're someone who's been a great thought partner for me through the years to try to understand the impact. Like, the natural push that I always come to is like, oh, gee golly, yes, a big transfer of wealth. I think it's pretty easy to say, well, doesn't that just mean we're going to exacerbate wealth inequality that we're talking about? Isn't a big pile of money within already rich families going to concentrate to another generation of rich families? Why isn't this an alarming thing that we're going to make wealth inequality worse? What are you seeing that gives you any kind of hope that this is a positive opportunity?
Well, one is APIS and Heritage.
Yeah.
And
All right. So we'll get to that case study. Yeah.
Huge fan of APIS and Heritage and what they're trying to do. And I'm really glad that Todd brought up something which is real, which is the racial wealth gap in the US. This is often cited, and it should be different and it should change. But for every $1 of wealth held by a white family, a Black family had 25 cents. And this is 2022 data from the Federal Reserve. So we know this is not by accident. It's by historical design of programs that systematically excluded Black families and other people of color from building and passing on wealth. Like Todd said, home ownership and business ownership being two key ones. So our theory of impact in my group for a long time, for the past decade, has really been about investing in inclusive entrepreneurship. And that's because we do see it as a pathway to ownership and asset building and generational wealth, which generational wealth for us is really the sustainable change. And so I think that when Black families and communities are systematically left out of wealth creation opportunities, all of us lose out. So part of the ways that we can address that, and what I wanted to just bring up, think about, Todd's going to talk in a minute about the businesses and the business owner transfer opportunity that we have. But if you think about, in the innovation economy, 40% of early stage entrepreneurs who are raising money through friends and family investment, this is, because of the racial wealth gap and the longstanding gender inequities, many entrepreneurs don't have access to this network to even allow them to get that start. And so they're prevented from testing innovations and hiring people and having any kind of runway. And actually, all the things I'm mentioning can be challenged. We can address these things by providing direct funding for programs if you're using philanthropic capital, and by ensuring that investors understand the opportunity that we have to build the future that we want and invest in founders and build the ecosystem around this potential that we can all benefit from. So I think that if we want to create impact at any level of scale, we need to address and look at what those levers in the systems look like. So that's what makes me very excited to see innovations and founders like Todd and his co-founder with Apis and Heritage, because all of these things are going to be needed to ensure that there's generational wealth that can be built and passed down.
You hit on 2 points there. One I want to underline, and one will get me back to Todd pretty elegantly. So thanks for that, Jamie. But one, we technically just dropped a report we did in part with Jamie called The Inclusion Edge, taking a hard look of like the pandemic era entrepreneurship boom that we've seen, that Black women in particular, but women overall have been largely responsible for a giant peak in business formation during the pandemic era after a long-standing set of declines. And the main question of this report we did was, did a bunch of investments around inclusive entrepreneurship have anything to do with that pop? Like, did it just happen because of pandemic weirdness, or did programmatic work get us there? And the answer from dozens of people across both economics fields and economic field is that something happened, that programmatic work that, like you partially highlighted, Jamie, did do something. We did see business formation pop among women, and particularly women of color, particularly Black women, because of some programmatic work. It isn't responsible for all of the pop, but some of it very really was a foundation laid before it. So that for me is one of your answers to why does this moment not just mean worsening wealth inequality. One is programmatic focus on widening who gets into the conversation on entrepreneurial assets. But two, and this is what can bring me back to Todd, is you noted that people seem to be doing something different with their wealth once there is this generational handover. Something different happens. That's across wealth classes. It's why so many people think of it as an opportunity. But we're going to zero in on the business side of it because, one, it's what we technically cover, but also, Todd, because you at Apis and Heritage are directing this head on. So, Todd, you got an example for me. By the way, you were forced to come with one, so you have to. What is an example of what can happen when there is a transfer of a business asset that can be done differently, that can benefit more folks in the conversation?
Well, Chris, and I'll use your statement around things happening differently now or recently than they have before, and jump off from that statistic. So note that, about 40 years ago, about 30% of businesses, small businesses, transferred down to a family member. So a son or daughter who was able, to take over the business. Here we are 30, 40 years later, only about 15% of businesses are transferred down to children or the family members. So some of that change in behavior around moving assets, at least in the business context, is almost a necessity. Who is going to take it over? And we always joke and say, hey, you created this business to give your kids all the opportunity in the world, and they went and took all the opportunities in the world, but now we got to pass this business down. So I'll give you a couple of examples, real life examples of how some of these transfers, how we've helped facilitate some of these transfers. And one of the reasons why, at least in the employee ownership space and the employee transition space, this has been happening, is there has been new sorts of financing. So Apis and Heritage is part of a small number of funds out there that are providing financing to specifically do these sorts of transitions from closely held, privately held into, we focus on ESOPs, but also bringing a lot of the co-op employee ownership principles. But I'll give one example. I'll keep it, I won't go specifics, but company that's been owned by over 40 years by one owner, one family. The founding owner started the business 40 years ago, grew it in a very real way, and came to the point in the life where his family decided, hey, it's time to get out of this. We need to retire. We need to take care of grandkids. We need to continue to move on. And they went out and had an investment banker, and were actively looking to sell this business. And we're looking at all the traditional ways of selling the business. Who are your lower middle market private equity firms? Who are your strategic buyers? Who are other individuals who want to add this to the portfolio? And what we were able to do is bring in another option, an option that oftentimes is not brought up in the conversation, which is, how about selling to your employees? And I'll tell you, 9 times out of 10, once owners become aware that that's a possibility to sell their business, to get the same type of liquidity that they would get selling to a traditional buyer, but provide that wealth building opportunity for the people that built their business with them. Some of them have been around for 30 more years. I mean, it's a light bulb, it's a smile. And once they know it can happen, they're oftentimes making that choice. So the heart of a lot of these business owners, the heart for their workforce, the heart to keep their legacy going and to keep the business where it is kind of in place and not have it, shipped someplace else or stripped out. That heart is often there, and we're able to bring the financing to make the pocket meet the heart in a very real way. So that's how things are happening differently in teams like ours, and other teams are making it happen.
I could dig in a lot more. I just want to share some of the comments coming in, but just people in different forms are just noting that access was different during the pandemic. Thanks for that. Among these others, the point I think that maybe I'll close with, and Jamie, maybe you can help bring me home here, that the richest generation in American history is at or past retirement stage. And it's very easy for people to not want to think about what happens next and fall into what has always happened before. And I hear both Todd and Jamie being like, guys, the opportunity is to do anything different here, whether in Todd's case, that is consider employee ownership for a pathway for that family business, or any other way. And I guess, Jamie, I'm wondering, you do a lot of this talking. Do you have a rallying cry for folks like, this is an opportunity that is deeply personal? You might have it as a personal experience or in your network. What is your rallying cry for folks to not just fall into the easiest solution, but instead do something that can be done differently? Do you have a rallying cry for people?
I mean, if it was anything, it's just to embrace this opportunity that we do have. There's a lot wrong in the world, but I do think that understanding how capital flows, understanding what we can do when we are united around purpose, particularly around more equity in the world. I think this is an opportunity for all of us. And I just appreciate the innovations in the founder community, in fund managers, in things like what Apis and Heritage is doing. And so the more that we can learn about what these are, I think the more that we can shift capital in ways that are better for everybody.
I love that. And we got some fans for selling to employees showing up in the chat. So we'll shout them out. Everyone, I've gone over time. Jamie, Todd, thank you so much for that conversation. That's Todd Leverette, the founding partner at Apis and Heritage. They help workers buy the companies they work for. And Jamie Sears, co-head of Impact for UBS America, has first pushed me on this topic. Jamie and Todd, thank you guys so much for the conversation.
Thanks, Chris.
We'll see you next time, everybody.